Right now, at this very moment, there's a country most people can't even locate on a map that's about to become wealthier per capita than the United States. And here's what nobody is telling you. This isn't happening over decades or generations. We're talking about a complete economic transformation in less than 10 years. A nation that was surviving on rice and sugar exports is now sitting on a treasure so massive that global superpowers are quietly repositioning their chess pieces across an entire continent. But before we reveal what's really happening in Guyana, you need to understand something critical. What you're about to hear isn't just an economics lesson. This is a masterclass in how a country of barely 800,000 people is outsmarting nations 100 times their size, and why the world's most powerful governments are desperately trying to get a piece of what's unfolding there. Let me start with a question that should terrify every economist. What happens when a country's economy doesn't just grow, but triples in size in 3 years? Not 30 years. 3. Because that's exactly what happened to Guyana, and almost nobody saw it coming. While the world was obsessed with cryptocurrency crashes and tech bubbles, this small South American nation quietly became the blueprint for the fastest wealth creation in modern history. And the truly mind-bending part, they're just getting started. Here's what the mainstream narrative won't tell you. Everyone thinks this story begins in 2015 with an oil discovery. Wrong. This story actually begins with a gamble so audacious that it redefined what's possible in international economics. Picture this. Guyana, wedged between Venezuela, Brazil, and Suriname, had been independent since 1966. For decades, they were the definition of economic struggle. Their primary exports were sugar, rice, and gold. Respectable, sure, but hardly the ingredients for explosive wealth. The country's infrastructure was crumbling. Brain drain was hemorrhaging their brightest minds to North America and Europe. And their GDP per capita was hovering around $4,000, making them one of the poorest nations in South America. But here's where it gets interesting. In the early 2000s, Guyana's government made a decision that would either destroy them or transform them. They opened up their offshore maritime territory to oil exploration, offering terms so favorable to foreign companies that critics called it reckless. Think about the risk. Oil exploration in deep water is astronomically expensive. Companies spend hundreds of millions just searching, with no guarantee of finding anything. Guyana was betting their entire economic future on the possibility, the mere chance, that something valuable existed beneath the turquoise waters of their coast. For years, nothing. Dry wells, failed prospects, mounting skepticism. Then came May 2015. ExxonMobil's drilling ship, operating under a subsidiary called Esso Exploration, struck something at a site they'd named Liza 1. But this wasn't just oil. This was a geological jackpot that would make geologists question everything they thought they knew about the region. Initial estimates suggested maybe 1 or 2 billion barrels. Respectable, but not earth-shattering. Then the assessments kept climbing. 3 billion, 5 billion, 8 billion. As of now, the confirmed recoverable reserves exceed 11 billion barrels, with experts believing the total could reach 15 billion or more. To put that in perspective, that's more oil per capita than Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, or the United Arab Emirates. A country with fewer people than South Dakota was suddenly sitting on more oil wealth per citizen than almost anywhere on Earth. But here's what nobody is telling you about that discovery. The location of this oil wasn't random. Guyana sits atop something geologists call the Guyana-Suriname Basin, a geological formation that experts now believe could be one of the most oil-rich regions discovered in the past 50 years. And here's the kicker, they've only explored a fraction of it. Every few months, ExxonMobil announces another discovery. Payara, Pakura, Yellowtail, Uaru, each one adding hundreds of millions of additional barrels to the total. This isn't a single oil field. This is an entire constellation of reserves that keeps expanding every time they drop a drill. Now, most countries that discover oil take years, sometimes decades, to start production. Environmental studies, infrastructure development, refinery construction, the bureaucratic machinery moves slowly. Guyana went from discovery to production in 4 years. December 2019, the first barrel of Guyanese oil hit the market. How? Because they structured deals that incentivize speed. ExxonMobil, along with partners Hess Corporation and CNOOC, didn't just get drilling rights. They got a partnership where success meant mutual benefit at an unprecedented scale. And the oil quality, light sweet crude, the premium grade that refineries fight over. Here's where the numbers start to sound like science fiction. In 2020, Guyana's economy grew by 43.5% in a single year, during a global pandemic. While most of the world was in recession, Guyana's GDP exploded. Then 2021, another 20% growth. Then 2022, the year that broke the models. 62.3% economic growth in 12 months. To understand how insane that is, consider that a healthy economy grows at 2 to 3% annually. China's miracle years saw 8 to 10%. Guyana did 62%. The International Monetary Fund, an organization not known for hyperbole, projected that by 2024, Guyana would achieve the highest GDP growth rate of any country in recorded history, 38.4% in a single year. But let's talk about what this actually means, because raw percentages can feel abstract. In 2017, Guyana's GDP was about $3.5 billion. By 2023, it had reached approximately $15 billion. That's more than quadrupling in 6 years. The government's oil revenues alone are projected to hit $1.6 billion annually by 2025, and that's conservative. Some analysts believe it could reach $3 billion per year by 2030. For a country with 800,000 people, that's life-changing wealth. We're talking about the potential for a GDP per capita that could rival or exceed wealthy Gulf states. Now, here's the part of the story where most documentaries would tell you everything is perfect, and Guyana is headed for utopia. But that's not what's really happening, and this is where the story gets complicated in fascinating ways. Because Guyana isn't just managing an oil boom. They're navigating something far more dangerous, the resource curse. History is littered with countries that discovered massive oil wealth and then imploded. Venezuela, literally Guyana's neighbor, is the perfect cautionary tale. Massive oil reserves, and yet economic collapse, hyperinflation, political chaos. Nigeria, another example. Enormous oil wealth, and yet widespread poverty and corruption. The pattern repeats across the globe. So the question isn't whether Guyana found oil. The question is whether they can avoid the trap that's destroyed so many others. And here's what makes Guyana's approach genuinely different. First, they established the Natural Resource Fund, essentially a sovereign wealth fund, in 2019, before the oil money even started flowing. Every dollar from oil revenues goes into this fund, and strict rules govern how it can be spent. The idea is Norway's model: save the majority, invest globally, and only use a small percentage for current expenses. It's disciplined, it's strategic, and it's the opposite of what most oil-rich nations do, which is spend immediately and recklessly. Second, and this is crucial, Guyana's government publicly committed to using oil revenues for massive infrastructure development, not just filling budget holes. They've announced plans for a new deepwater port that could handle the largest container ships in the world, positioning Guyana as a logistics hub for South America. They're building a bridge across the Demerara River, a project that will transform internal commerce. They're developing a highway to Brazil's northern region, creating a trade corridor that could redirect billions in goods. They're upgrading their international airport to handle increased traffic. This isn't just spending. This is nation building with surgical precision. If you're finding this story as fascinating as we are, do us a favor. Hit that subscribe button right now. We're on a mission to reach 10,000 subscribers, and your support means we can keep bringing you these deep dive stories that nobody else is covering. Seriously, tap that button. It takes 2 seconds and helps us more than you know. Now, back to Guyana's strategy, because this is where it gets even more interesting. The government isn't just building infrastructure. They're investing heavily in education. New schools, upgraded universities, scholarship programs to send Guyanese students abroad and then incentivize their return. Why? Because they understand something fundamental. Oil wealth is temporary, but human capital is permanent. They're trying to build a knowledge economy in parallel with the oil economy, so when the oil eventually runs out, hopefully decades from now, they have something sustainable to fall back on. The healthcare sector is also seeing unprecedented investment. Modern hospitals, training programs for doctors and nurses, public health initiatives targeting diseases that have plagued the region for generations. The goal is ambitious. Transform Guyana into a medical hub for the Caribbean and northern South America. Again, this is long-term thinking that transcends the oil boom. But let's address the elephant in the room, corruption. Because no matter how well-intentioned the plans are, oil money attracts corruption like blood attracts sharks. Guyana's government has faced criticism, and not without reason. There have been concerns about transparency and how contracts are awarded. Questions about whether ExxonMobil's deal is too favorable to the company. Accusations of political figures benefiting personally from oil-related decisions. Transparency International ranks Guyana's corruption perception as moderate, not terrible, but not great either. The risk is real. One major corruption scandal could unravel years of progress. However, here's a data point that matters. International organizations are watching Guyana extremely closely. The World Bank, the IMF, the Inter-American Development Bank, all of them have teams on the ground, providing not just funding but oversight and technical assistance. It's in everyone's interest that Guyana succeeds because if they do, it becomes a replicable model for other small nations. That external scrutiny, while not perfect, creates accountability that wouldn't exist otherwise. Now let's talk about something the mainstream media barely covers, the geopolitical chess game unfolding around Guyana. Because this isn't just about oil. This is about influence, power, and the reshaping of South American dynamics. Venezuela, Guyana's western neighbor, has claimed for decades that a huge portion of Guyana, the Essequibo region, actually belongs to them. This isn't new. It's a territorial dispute dating back to the 19th century. But here's what changed. Oil. That Essequibo region. It includes the offshore areas where most of the oil was discovered. Suddenly, Venezuela's interest in this dispute went from historical grievance to urgent national priority. In late 2023, Venezuela held a referendum asking its citizens whether they supported annexing Essequibo. The Venezuelan government claimed overwhelming support. Guyana called it a provocation. International observers called it alarming. Because if Venezuela, despite its current economic weakness, decided to make a military move, Guyana couldn't defend itself. They have virtually no military to speak of. This is where the United States enters the picture. The U.S. has made it crystal clear that any territorial aggression against Guyana would be met with serious consequences. Why? Partly because of international law and supporting a democratic ally. But let's be honest about the real reason. ExxonMobil is an American company, and the U.S. government has a vested interest in protecting American corporate investments, especially ones this valuable. The U.S. has conducted joint military exercises with Guyana, a signal to Venezuela that's impossible to miss. Meanwhile, Brazil, which shares a border with Guyana to the south, has also indicated it would oppose any Venezuelan aggression. So Guyana, despite its size, suddenly has heavyweight protectors, all because of what lies beneath its waters. China is also circling. Chinese companies are investing in Guyana's infrastructure, offering loans and development deals. Some see this as beneficial foreign investment. Others see it as China expanding its influence in South America, a region traditionally considered part of the U.S. sphere of influence. The Belt and Road Initiative hasn't officially extended to Guyana yet, but the groundwork is being laid. And let's not forget the Caribbean community, CARICOM, of which Guyana is a member. The entire region is watching Guyana's transformation, because if it succeeds, it changes the calculus for every small Caribbean and South American nation about what's possible economically. Here's another angle almost nobody discusses: environmental concerns. Guyana contains part of the Amazon rainforest. It's one of only a few countries in the world with net negative carbon emissions, meaning their forests absorb more carbon than the country produces. This has given Guyana significant moral authority in international climate discussions. But oil production, even with modern standards, has environmental impacts. Offshore drilling carries risks: spills, ecosystem disruption, air quality from flaring. Guyana is trying to thread an impossible needle: develop oil wealth while maintaining their environmental credentials. They've committed to keeping the vast majority of their rainforest intact, and they're investing oil revenues partly into conservation programs. But critics ask a fair question: can you really be an environmental leader while becoming one of the world's largest per capita oil producers? Guyana's response is essentially, we didn't cause climate change, the developed world did, and we deserve the opportunity to develop economically just like they did. It's a compelling argument, but it's also a moral tightrope. The international community is watching to see if Guyana can actually pull off sustainable oil development, or if that's an oxymoron. Let's get back to the economy, because there's a dimension of this story that's absolutely critical: diversification. Guyana's leaders understand that oil dependence is a death trap. So while oil drives the headlines, there's been aggressive investment in other sectors. Gold mining, which has been part of Guyana's economy for over a century, is being modernized and expanded. The goal is to double gold production over the next decade. Agriculture is being revolutionized with new technologies, irrigation systems, and access to international markets. Guyana wants to become a major food exporter for the Caribbean. Tourism is also being developed, capitalizing on Guyana's pristine rainforests, spectacular waterfalls, and unique biodiversity. The pitch: ecotourism for adventurous travelers. The technology sector is perhaps the most ambitious diversification play. Guyana is investing in fiber optic infrastructure and trying to position itself as a nearshore outsourcing destination for North American companies. Call centers, software development, digital services. The idea is that with a young, English-speaking population and improving education, Guyana could capture some of the business that currently goes to India, the Philippines, or Mexico. It's early, but the infrastructure is being built. Here's a statistic that should blow your mind. In 2017, Guyana's GDP per capita was about $4,500. By 2023, it had reached approximately $18,000. That's a four-fold increase in 6 years. If current projections hold, by 2030, it could exceed $40,000, which would place Guyana among the wealthiest nations in the Western Hemisphere. For context, the current U.S. GDP per capita is around $70,000, but that's averaged across 330 million people. For Guyana to reach even $40,000 with their small population and recent poverty levels would be one of the most dramatic economic transformations in human history. But here's the reality check, and this is important. Not every Guyanese citizen is feeling this boom equally, at least not yet. Wealth concentration is a real issue. The benefits of oil money are flowing to certain sectors and certain people faster than others. Rural communities, especially indigenous populations in the interior, report feeling left behind. Unemployment is still an issue for many. even as GDP explodes. The cost of living has increased dramatically, with housing prices in Georgetown, the capital, skyrocketing. This has created tension. If the government doesn't ensure inclusive growth, where every Guyanese sees tangible improvements in their life, social unrest becomes a real possibility. The government's response has been to roll out social programs, cash transfers to families, subsidies for education and health care, infrastructure projects specifically targeting rural areas. But programs take time to implement and even longer to show results. The challenge is managing expectations. When people hear their country is getting insanely rich, they expect to feel it personally and immediately. When they don't, frustration builds. This is the political tightrope Guyana's leaders are walking right now. Elections in Guyana have historically been fraught, often divided along ethnic lines between the Indo-Guyanese and Afro-Guyanese communities. The oil boom has raised the stakes of political power to an entirely new level. Whoever controls the government controls the oil wealth. The 2020 election was disputed and took months to resolve, with international observers needed to verify results. The fear is that as oil revenues increase, elections could become even more contentious, potentially destabilizing the very foundation of Guyana's success. Let's talk numbers again, because they're staggering. ExxonMobil's offshore operations are producing over 380,000 barrels of oil per day as of 2023, and they're on track to reach 1.2 million barrels per day by 2027. For a small country, this is an almost incomprehensible scale. That production level would place Guyana among the top 20 oil-producing nations globally, ahead of countries like Algeria, Brazil, and Kazakhstan. And remember, this is mostly from just a few developed fields. The potential is far larger. The production-sharing agreement Guyana signed with ExxonMobil has been controversial. Critics argue that Guyana's share, roughly 14.5% of revenues after costs, is too low compared to international standards where governments typically take 50 to 80%. ExxonMobil and its partners argue that the terms reflect the high risk they took when they started exploration, and that Guyana's take will increase dramatically over time as production scales. Both sides have valid points, but the debate underscores a critical question. Is Guyana getting a fair deal, or is it being taken advantage of? Here's my take, and this is where analysis requires nuance. At the time the deal was signed, Guyana had zero proven oil reserves and was considered a frontier market with high exploration risk. The terms reflect that reality. Companies needed strong incentives to invest. Now that the oil is confirmed and production is online, renegotiating might make sense, and there are indications the government is exploring that. But renegotiating contracts with multinational corporations is complex and risky. Push too hard, and investment dries up. Don't push hard enough and you leave billions on the table. It's a negotiation where Guyana holds some cards, but not all of them. One of the most underreported aspects of this story is the human element. Guyana has experienced a brain drain for decades. Educated Guyanese would leave for opportunities in the US, Canada, or the UK and rarely return. But that's changing. The oil boom has reversed the trend. Guyanese expatriates are coming home, bringing skills, capital, and international networks. There's a palpable sense of optimism, a feeling that for the first time in generations, staying in Guyana or returning to Guyana isn't a sacrifice but an opportunity. That psychological shift is enormously important for the country's future. Universities in Guyana are seeing increased enrollment, especially in fields like engineering, geology, environmental science, and business. Young Guyanese now believe there are careers available locally that can match or exceed what they'd find abroad. Companies are setting up regional headquarters in Georgetown. International conferences are being hosted there. The national psychology is shifting from scarcity to abundance, and that shift if managed well, can be as valuable as the oil itself. Before we wrap up, let's address the big question that's probably on your mind. Is this sustainable? Because history teaches us that resource booms often lead to busts. Oil prices fluctuate. Fields get depleted. Economies built entirely on extraction collapse when the resources run out. So what's different here? First, Guyana is planning for the long term. The Natural Resource Fund isn't just for show. It's structured to save the majority of revenues and invest them globally, creating a perpetual income stream even after the oil is gone. If they stick to this discipline, and that's a big if, Guyana could have sovereign wealth that generates income for generations. Second, the diversification efforts, while still early, show an understanding that oil is a foundation, not the entire building. And third, the scale of the reserves means that even with aggressive production, there's decades of extraction ahead, giving Guyana time to build alternative economic pillars. But let's be brutally honest, the risk of failure is real. Resource curses happen because they're easy to fall into. The temptation to spend now, to use oil money for short-term political gains, to allow corruption to seep in, these temptations are enormous. One bad government, one series of poor decisions, and Guyana could squander this opportunity. Venezuela thought they were too big to fail, and look what happened. So sustainability isn't guaranteed. It's a choice Guyana has to make every single day through policy, governance, and accountability. Now, here's where I want you to engage. Drop a comment below and tell me, do you think Guyana can avoid the resource curse? What would you do if you were leading the country right now? And here's another question. Could your country replicate what Guyana is doing if a similar discovery happened? What would need to change? I'm genuinely curious about your thoughts, so let's get a conversation going in the comments. As we close out this deep dive, let's zoom out to the global picture. Guyana's story is being watched by small nations everywhere. Because if an English-speaking country of 800,000 people can go from economic obscurity to potential wealth, rivaling the Gulf states in less than a decade, what does that mean for other small nations? What does it mean for global power dynamics? We're living through a moment where the rules of economic development are being rewritten in real time. Guyana's rise challenges assumptions. It challenges the idea that only large nations can achieve rapid wealth. It challenges the inevitability of the resource curse. And it challenges the notion that geography is destiny. Yes, they got lucky with geology, but luck alone doesn't triple an economy. Execution, strategy, and governance do. The next 5 to 10 years will determine whether Guyana becomes a model or a cautionary tale. Will they manage their wealth wisely, spreading benefits across all citizens, building infrastructure and institutions that outlast the oil? Or will they fall into the traps that have ensnared so many others? The world is watching, investors are betting, and the people of Guyana are living through history. What nobody is telling you is this: Guyana isn't just becoming rich. Guyana is running an experiment in accelerated development that could redefine what small nations are capable of achieving. This is the story of how a country nobody paid attention to became impossible to ignore. This is how Guyana is becoming insanely rich.